rise of bipedal movement and the Ouranopithecus. They called me the boy with dust in his elbows. My mother said it like a curse, my papo said it like a blessing. Every day that summer I came home stained a pale, chalky brown from wrists to shoulder, my shins freckled with pebbles, my hair stuck up in places that weren't natural for anyone but a hedgehog. It wasn't just dirt. It was dust from the hill west of our village, the one that looked like the back of a sleeping cow, and inside that hill were the oldest teeth I had ever seen, older than Papo's. Older than the White Tower in Thessaloniki. Older than the Jesus icons in the church or the stories about the resistance. Old. Old like the earth itself. The men and women who came for the teeth called themselves paleontologists, which in my head sounded like paleontologists, like they worked at the market with the round yellow onions that make you cry. But they didn't sell anything, and only once did I see anyone cry, and that was when the French man spilled his cheap coffee on what he called the field notes, a little notebook that was always in his pocket like a pet. My father, who cut hair in a square room with a single big window in the Ladodica, would say that all of them were just playing in the dirt. He said it with a smile that had some worry inside. He wanted me to work with him after school, to sweep up the clipped curls and sideburns, and eventually to hold the scissors while men sat down and told me their business. He said barbering was a good life if you were quick with a joke and your hands, and if you could keep secrets. But the only secrets I wanted were in the hill. I was 12 that summer. 12 and thin as a fishing rod, with knees that could carry a whole town of scabs. I wore the same pair of shorts most days, the ones with the patched back pocket where I kept my treasure, a little brush with soft bristles that the woman scientist, Dr. Eleni, had given me. For the delicate things, she'd said, pressing it into my hand with a smile that made her eyes look like someone had drawn commas at the corners. Only for fossils and figs, she added, and I, having stolen exactly 3 figs that week from Mrs. Fotini's tree when they were still green and made your mouth feel like fur, nodded and tried to look innocent. Our village was a place of dust and sun. The roads were hard and bright. People sat in front of their houses and shouted greetings down the length of the street, or grumbled into their coffee, or leaned in close to talk with the newspaper still folded under their arms. You could smell olive oil and grilled sardines at almost any hour if the wind was right, and also the sweet rot of figs that had fallen and burst open on the ground, and the black tar smell of the road that melted a little bit in the hottest part of the day. Cicadas droned like someone had left a radio on only for static, and the church bell struck lazily at the quarters. Sometimes Papa gave me a coin and sent me to buy cowlery and packets of shag for the smoker next door who always said he would quit once the junta fell, like they were the ones lighting his cigarettes. I didn't understand much about politics. Only that the men at the Cafaneo sometimes lowered their voices when they mentioned names. Only that my father's jaw got quiet when the radio spoke of Cyprus. It felt the way the air felt before a big storm, when the light looks clear but not friendly, and the trees stop moving. The paleontologists came in a dusty cream-colored Land Rover that looked like it had been through a war and then through a vineyard, and then someone had slapped a new tire on it and told it to behave. They were from the university in Thessaloniki, mostly, and 2 from France. I couldn't remember their French names at first, because they sounded like someone trying to speak with a mouthful of bread, but I tried. Then I started calling them by other things in my head, Monsieur Cigarette, because he always had one, and Madame Shoes, because she wore city shoes that sank in the dirt and made her say words I was not supposed to know. There was also our own Dr. Eleni, from Thessaloniki, her hair a black rope coiled at the back of her head, her hands brown and sure. And there was Mr. Petros, who had a beard like a saint in an icon, but laugh lines like he had been a sinner too. They set up measuring tapes on the hillside and put up little strings in squares. If you have never seen a dig, it looks at first like they are cutting the earth into a cake. The strings go taut and neat, and inside them the dirt is leveled and carefully scraped with trowels until it shines in a way I didn't know dirt could shine. They mark each square with letters and numbers on little sticks, and they write in their notebooks and talk in low voices, and sometimes they lie down on the ground and look with one eye shut like one more grain of sand could tell them a secret. They brought sieves, too, wooden frames with metal mesh, and they scooped up buckets of the earth and shook them, and the dust flew up in little clouds and turned their faces the color of old paper. They said that the hill had given bones before horse bones from a time when horses had 3 toes, like our old neighbor, the one with the missing pinky. And bones of antelopes and big cows with horns that curved like the moon. And once, a piece of a giraffe. But not a long-necked giraffe like the ones you see in picture books. A strange kind, short-necked, almost normal except for its funny face. I could imagine them, clattering in this very place, the way, when you close your eyes in church, you can almost see the saints stepping down off the walls and stretching their stiff gold halos. We were west of Thessaloniki, far enough that the city was a hum in the distance, close enough to seeing the ships on bright clear days. The hill had been the edge of a little creek that ran down and joined the Axios River, the big brown ribbon that cut the plain in half and carried things to the sea and to us. Now the creek only ran when it rained, and even then it was thin and shy and you could step across if you didn't mind your sandals sinking a little bit in the soft place where weeds grew. The first time I saw a fossil, a real one, I didn't know what I was looking at. It looked like the oldest piece of bread crust you could imagine, embedded in the earth. It was just a hint, a curve, a ridge. The kind of thing a person might kick without thinking. But then I saw the way Dr. Eleni leaned in, not breathing, and the way her hand stopped at the edge of it with respect, like when you are almost touching an icon and then you remember you are not supposed to. Something, she breathed. Something. What is? I asked, too loud, and Mr. Petros held a finger to his lips and then winked at me. I watched as they used the little picks and the tiny brushes, the one smaller than the one in my pocket, to clear away the earth grain by grain. They put the dirt into little bags, which they labeled and set aside, like even the dirt was evidence. The curve came into focus. It was a tooth, bigger than any tooth I had seen. Not like the molars I'd seen when the butcher pulled open a lamb's jaw. This was like a big, cracked, pale fruit, polished by time. Tooth, said Madame Shoes, in Greek, carefully, the way you tell a dog to sit. Odonti. Odonti, I said back, like tasting something sweet. What animal? I asked. Too soon, said Dr. Eleni, but her fingers shook a little in a way that told me her head was already guessing. That night I went home with my elbows in dust and my head full of teeth. My mother tsked and made me wash them in a bowl in the courtyard, watching the water turn the color of coffee. If you bring one more bucket of that hill into my house, I'll send you to live on it, she said, but she rubbed my back with the towel until I was warm and sleepy, and her mouth softened when I told her about the big tooth, and how careful everyone was, and how Madame Shoes had said Odonti as if the word was something she wanted to keep. At dinner, we ate beans with tomato and some little fish, and my father listened while I told about the grid of strings and the tiny brushes. He made a face when I had finished. Imagine if I gave haircuts one hair at a time, he said. He laughed, and then he shook his head. So much fuss for a tooth. Maybe it's not just a tooth, I said, and then I realized I had said it as if I were in charge of secrets. I started to explain and then stopped. My father's face sometimes shifted without him knowing. It was something he did when he thought about money, and sometimes when he thought about politics. It was like a shadow moved inside him. "Drink your water," he said softly. "There are louder things in the world than teeth. Your mother and I need you to walk that bread to your aunt in the morning. She has too many little ones and her husband is away again." "Where?" I asked, and then I remembered that it wasn't my business, not really, and that my aunt would answer me by pressing her lips together and putting another spoonful of soup in my bowl. "In the city," said my mother. "At the port." That night I could not sleep. The cicadas had started their little machines, and it felt like they were right under my pillow. I went out and lay in the courtyard on the mat where the sun warmed clothes in the day and made the smell of soap and leaves. The sky was a bowl turned upside down over me, with a few chips knocked out where the stars showed through. I thought about teeth. I thought about walking. It sounds strange, but I thought about the way we walk. I had watched the scientists all day, and they had a certain way to their steps, careful and bent, like old men. And then, at the edge of the hill, there were goats. The goats walk on four legs, of course, their knees going the wrong way, their eyes like someone had stuck the wrong marbles in. I wondered what it would be like to walk like that. My papo sometimes joked that the men at the Cafaneo could do with some walking, that their bellies had learned to sit better than their feet had learned to move. That summer I had delivered so many messages on foot that the road knew my footprints, and I loved it. When I ran, I felt like I could pour the whole sun into my chest and keep it there. In the morning I tied the bread in a cloth and carried it to my aunt's. If you have ever carried a warm loaf of bread in the cool of a morning in summer, you know that it is like walking with a hearth under your arm. It makes you think you are wiser than you are. You can smell every street like it's telling you its secrets, which house cooked lentils, which had onions, which had thyme tucked in their walls. My aunt kissed my cheeks and squeezed me until my ears popped. In the corner, the baby was pulling on the ear of the oldest, and the middle one was sitting with a spoon and a bowl and a snail shell, as if to charm it into being soup. "School?" my aunt asked, tucking hair behind my ear. It was late June. School was a loose cloud then, something that separated like fingers. "Now the hill," I said, and she rolled her eyes and gave me a glass of water and a half-dried fig, sugar crisp in it like sand. "If you start living there, tell me which cupboard to put your shoes," she said. I went to the hill running, and it was still cool, but the sun was already thinking about how it would be midday. When I got there, the Land Rover was parked at a stupid angle, as if it had tried to climb and then changed its mind. The Frenchman was squinting at a map even though he had seen the hill every day for a month. That's the thing about the scientists. They look with their eyes until their eyes know things, and then they look with their papers to see if the papers approve. "Yasu," I called, and they all made little hellos, and someone threw me a boiled egg in a bit of paper. Madame Shoes was bent over the string grid, talking to the dirt very softly in French, as if it would respond if she was polite enough. That made me like her more. They had uncovered more of the tooth. It was big, broad, and flat, and it had thick enamel, which is the shiny hard part around your teeth that keeps your stew from making them holes of pain. I learned the word enamel that day. I liked how it felt in my mouth, like a thing you put on the nails of a boat to make them strong. Enamel. "It's a molar," said Mr. Petros. He measured it with calipers. He wrote down numbers. He showed me the ridges, which he called cusps, and the little dips between them, and he held my hand with his and traced the shape in the air. "The enamel is thick," he said. "Thicker than in some apes." That tells us about diet. Harder foods. Maybe nuts. Maybe tough things. The environment was different then. Seasonally dry. He spoke to me as if I could keep all that in my head, and I tried. The word seasonally was new. It felt like a word with a coat on. Seasonally dry. He said Miocene, and I said it back. 9 million years, give or take. That's what he told me. 9 million. I tried to make 9 million of anything inside my head. 9 million olives, 9 million sips of lemonade. 9 million steps. It's like every one of your steps today, and then again and again until every rock on the hill is polished by your foot, said Monsieur Cigarette, in a kind voice that made me forgive him for the smoke that always seemed to be moving toward me. He used his cigarette to draw a line in the air. He kept his ash long and he always seemed surprised when it fell. It might be Ouranopithecus, said Dr. Eleni, her voice quiet. It sounded like a prayer and a dare. It looks like it. I said the word Ouranopithecus to myself. Ouranos is sky. Pithecos is monkey. Sky monkey. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Sky monkey. If you like, she smiled. But not a monkey. An ape. Apes are different. No tails. How can you know that from a tooth? I asked, and a few of the others laughed. We don't know. We guess from where and when and shape, said Madame Shoes in careful Greek, and I liked her even more. But we never just guess. I crouched and looked closer. It was only part of a jaw then, and one big tooth in it, like someone had thrown a seed of marble in the ground and the hill had grown around it to keep it safe. The enamel was like porcelain. I reached my fingers out and held them in the air and then pulled them back. They had taught me, you didn't touch. You only touched what you could replace, and they didn't make more Miocene apes in any factory. We don't have any limb bones, said Mr. Petros, as if hearing my secret question. We don't know how it walked. For bipedalism, we look for different things. Hips. Knees. Feet. But this is beautiful. What's bipedalism? I asked, tasting the word like a mouthful of filo pastry that flakes everywhere. Walking on two legs, he said. Habitually. All the time. Not just sometimes. He looked at my feet, which were dirty and scratched and had a band-aid of paper and spit on one toe. The way you do. I wanted to say that I only did it because it made everything easier. I could carry a bucket, or a school bag, or steal a fig more effectively that way. But I also knew that sometimes when the goats were running in the gully after the rain and the mud was slick like soap in your hand, I dropped to my hands and knees without thinking and it felt easy. Do goats ever think about walking on two? I asked, mostly to see if anyone laughed. Only if they need to reach the fig you stole first, said Monsieur Cigarette, so I supposed he had seen me in the tree at some point. He grinned. His teeth were very white. Sky ape, I said again, tasting the words. Ouranopithecus, repeated Dr. Eleni. She picked up her notebook and wrote it, her handwriting so fast and neat that I wanted to be her pencil. From Ouranos, she added gently. Yes. Was it, us? I asked. I was nervous to ask that. The priests at church didn't talk much about our ancestors before Adam. But the science teacher at school had shown us a book with apes standing straighter and straighter until the last picture looked like a man in a bathing suit. It felt like a trick, but I could see what he meant too. No, said Monsieur Cigarette. Not us. Not directly. A cousin far, far away. A branch that doesn't go straight to you. There were many apes then. Many branches. This one lived here. That is the miracle enough, no. And what about walking on two legs? I asked, wanting to pull the words out and keep them. He shrugged, and ash fell from his cigarette like snow. That is a different story. A later one. You know of the Tong child? Maybe you do not. In Africa. A long time later than this. A child's skull that showed us how old things could be. Or the bones in South Africa, in caves. We have hints. We know that sometime, long after Ouranopithecus, your ancestors were walking on 2 feet. But that is there. This is here. I nodded and looked at my feet. The dirt had lines in it from my steps. Little, shallow prints. I pressed my toe in and made them deeper, then smudged them away with my heel, like a secret. That day they wrapped the piece in plaster. I watched them mix the powder with water in a bucket and stir with gloved hands. It smelled like a storm in a house. They cut strips of burlap and dipped them in the white slurry and smoothed them over the earth around the fossil, making a shell like a turtle's. They waited until it hardened and then they undercut the block and pried it up, gentle as anything alive. They flipped it and put more plaster on the backside. They wrote numbers on it with a marker and jaunty letters. They smiled at each other in the way men do when they have dug a hole and found not only what they hoped, but a bigger place for their hope. When they lifted it, I was underneath it for a second, looking up at the underside of the hill. That felt like magic, to see the earth's belly. You like this, eh? Asked Dr. Eleni, who had taken off her gloves and was rubbing a little crescent of plaster from her wrist with her thumbnail. You like the work. You are patient. I'm not patient, I said, stung a little, because boys do not like to be called patient. To me, patient meant sitting still while Aunt Irony picked the glue from my hair after I had stuck 2 pages of my homework together with olive oil by mistake. You are, she said. You are patient and stubborn. Good things for bones and life. That afternoon my father came up the hill. I saw him from far away because he walked like a good barber would walk, with no hurry but with a decision in it, and his spiky black hair was like a flag on his head. He took off his sunglasses and put them on his shirt like a man in a movie. Yeses, he said to the scientists, and they said hello and bringing out of words in Greek and French, and he nodded to me in a way that made something cold start in my stomach. You cannot be up here all the time, he said kindly but as if the words were iron. You help your mother. You deliver what you need to deliver. And sometimes you come to the shop and sweep. You think that hair sweeps itself. I wanted to tell him about the tooth. About the plaster and the smell of it. About Ouranopithecus, a word that tasted like a secret on my tongue. I wanted to tell him how my hands trembled when I watched the little brush move across the dirt, and how I held my breath until my face got hot. But he was my father, and he was watching my face with his barber eyes, the ones that can see the shape of a head as if it is a puzzle to be solved, and I said, "Yes, Papa," and everything I wanted to say stayed inside my mouth like bread that was too big. He put his hand on the top of my head like he was checking if I was level, and then he slid his hand into my hair with the motion of a comb, and then he left. "Your father loves you," said Mr. Petros, who knew how to bend rebar into stakes with his bare hands and, I suspected, could see farther than most. "I know," I said. Love and worry were the same in my father, as if the word he was trying to say had its letters in a tangle. The days were a pattern, then. I ran errands and listened to the radio and went to the hill and came home with the dust of 10,000 years on my skin. Sometimes they let me lay the tape measure across a trench and read off numbers. Sometimes I stood at the sieve and shook until my shoulders buzzed, and sometimes, if I got lucky, a fragment of tooth or a bit of bone winked up at me from the wire like a fish in a school, and I would gasp, and every scientist for 50 paces would look up with the same expression, like somebody had pulled a string in their heads. "Good eyes," said Madame Shoes. She took the tiny fragment, wet it with a drop of water on her finger, and the surface shone as if it had its own light. "Look. See the little stripes? We call that parachymata. It is where the enamel grew. Like rings in a tree, but on teeth." I had never thought of teeth growing in rings. I ran my tongue over my molars, feeling their battlefield, the places where hard grains of bread had made little cracks. Everything makes marks on us, I thought. Even chewing. Even walking. I kept the little brush in my pocket. I learned to sit so that my knees didn't hurt. I learned that you could tell a lot from dirt that others called plain. Some patches of soil were clay-like and red, sticky in the heat, and others were pale yellow and grainy and made your throat itch. Some layers were easy to scrape and some were stubborn, like old men who don't like new presidents. They called the stubborn ones calcrete, which sounded like a dessert but felt like a plate. In the afternoons, when the sun was white and the hill was blinking and even the cicadas had turned themselves down to a lower hum, we stood in the shade of the Land Rover and drank water that had gone warm, and ate tomatoes with salt and bread, and laughed at jokes we wouldn't remember next week. That was the summer the junta was like an old shirt with buttons falling off. In the city, men were talking with more noise in their voices. Names of politicians climbed like bubbles in the bottle of Coca-Cola that my father allowed on Fridays. When the radio spoke of Cyprus, my mother would crack her knuckles and wipe the table as if it had said a bad word. I heard words like invasion and coup, and I tried to hold them in my mouth the way I held mycene and enamel, but these did not taste like anything I wanted to keep. My papo had his stories from the hard years before I was born, his voice a low saw cutting through wood, even and quiet. He said we had to walk forward with our heads up. He said we had to stand upright, that we had been bent too long. He always laughed when he said it, as if the idea that a man should be bent was funny. I thought about walking a lot that summer. You would think that I would think mainly about teeth, but it was the feet that became my obsession. I watched the way everyone stepped. How Mr. Petros rolled from heel to toe like a dogged soldier, how Madame Shoes walked too carefully, head down, checking for holes as if one would jump up to trap her, how Monsieur Cigarette drifted as if he were listening to music only he could hear. I watched my mother's steps in the kitchen firm, with the authority of someone who knows what must be done and has the hips to make it happen without bumping into anything. My father, in the shop, moved like a dancer, a little step and a swivel and a bow, his hand on a man's head like a blessing. Walking was a language. Walking was a way of being brave and a way of hiding. If you walk too fast, people think you're nervous. If you walk too slow, they think you're arrogant or stupid. There is a middle way, my papo said, that says you are open to what comes and you are not afraid. He and I walked every evening, out of the village and along the ridge where the fields made squares of green and gold. He carried a walking stick, not because he needed it, but because it did something to his hand to hold it, and because it could turn into anything. He could point to a bird with it, he could poke a snake, he could lean on it to look at the city in the distance. The Axios River lay like a belt, and the smell of its mud came up in the late part of the day. Sometimes we saw flamingos down in the marsh, the pale pink of them like a secret in the gray water, and that made my papo quiet for a whole minute. "They're ridiculous," he would say finally, in the tone you use for things you love so much you can't explain it. He told me how, when he was a boy, his father made him walk over the mountain to bring olives to a cousin with a new baby, and how he had walked through a whole day of his life so his cousin could put oil on bread, and how he had never felt so useful. He told me how, during the war, he had walked in the dark, with more fear than legs, and how each step felt like a prayer you did not know the words for. He told me that men who cannot walk, who will not walk, forget how to be men. He meant something else and I was not sure what, but I nodded anyway. Do goats feel like men? I asked, and he whacked me gently with his stick. Goats feel like goats, and they are better at it than any man is at being a goat, he said. Don't be foolish. The weeks passed and the hill gave us more. A bit of mandible with the root sockets like empty wells. A premolar with a neat oval cusp. Pieces and pieces. We labeled bags and we wrote notes. We got excited over small things. We learned to be traditional and careful. When something wasn't certain, we said, maybe. We did not say must, even when we wanted to. One day it rained. The rain came out of a blue sky like it had been waiting and then someone had tapped a barometer with the handle of a spoon. The scientists swore in a mix of Greek and French and one or two colorful phrases in English and German. We scrambled like ants to cover the squares with tarps, to wrap the fragile places with more plaster, to put the notebooks under the Land Rover. The smell of wet dust is in my nose now if I close my eyes, the way the ground loosened to itself, the way the first drops were greedy and then the rest learned to follow. We sat under a tarp and ate bread and cheese while the rain drummed on the plastic like 1,000 small feet. Madame Shoes pointed to my feet and said, "You, barefoot, always. Are you not, how do you say, tender feet?" I looked at my toes, all scratches and little bruises like someone had given me a map. Only when I try to stand too still, I said. It was true. When I stood very still, for a long time, my arches hurt, and my mother told me it was because I was a fidget. The scientists debated arches then. Monsieur Cigarette made a little drawing of a foot in his notebook, showing how the bones sat, and he talked about how the way we walk is a puzzle of bones and tendons and balance. He said that our feet are like a work of stubborn art, that we are the only ones who walk like this all the time, who balance our heavy stupid heads up high on a curved spine and plant our steps in a rhythm like a drum. I imagined Ouranopithecus, the sky ape, moving through a place that looked different than this but also the same. I imagined its jaw, heavy and strong, cracking nuts or something like nuts, its eyes large, its face with an expression that we would call thinking. Did it ever stand and look out over its world? Did it ever see flamingos and call them ridiculous? I wanted to ask 100 questions, but I could feel that asking them would be like trying to drink the whole ocean. When the rain stopped, a frog appeared in one of the squares, surprised to find itself in a place with strings. We laughed. The frog licked its own eyeball. I decided that was my new superpower and tried to lick my own eyelid until my lips were salty and no closer to success. That evening, in the shop, my father was quiet. He was always quiet when he was worried. He held the scissors and they made a sound more like a whisper than a snip. I swept the floor and listened to men talk about the news, the bristle of their voices like the bristle on the back of my neck when the shepherd's dog got too close. They talked about tanks moving across the TV like toys. They talked about young men in uniforms and men in suits. They talked around the words like you talk around a sleeping baby. "Your boy is going to be a professor and leave you," said a man with a mustache so elegant it should have received its own mail. He gestured with his chin toward me and the sweep of hair I was coaxing under the chair. "Ha," said my father. He will be a barber and make more money than all those professors with their little brushes. It was a joke, I knew, but it made a small hot spot in my chest, like a coal in ashes. I didn't know what I would be, but I knew what I liked to feel under my hands. It wasn't hair. That weekend they found more of the jaw. It was a bigger piece, with 2 molars and the back of the jawbone thick where it would have reached up toward the skull. They were careful as a cat stepping around a bowl of milk. Word got around the village, because word can hear when you whisper it and it has good ears. People came and stood at the edge of the hill and made the noises you make at babies and at graves. Some crossed themselves. One man with big hair and bigger opinions said something about the folly of men who want to find monkeys when they could be finding God, and Mr. Petros said something about how God made all the monkeys too, so wasn't it good to say hello? The man harumphed. Harumph is a real sound people make. Boy with dust, said a voice, and I turned, and it was my aunt, who had left the children with my mother. She handed me a bottle of Fanta. For your hot head, she said, and kissed my temple, and I felt suddenly how tired I was, how the sun had filled me up like a lamp. They talked about the jaw for hours. They talked about the shape of the tooth roots, the thickness of the enamel, the size. They compared it to pictures in a book that had glossy pages, and to a plaster cast of something. They argued in friendly barking, like dogs who know each other. The ridge here, said Dr. Eleni, tracing a line with a clean fingernail. See how it is? And the thickness across. This is thick. Like I said. We can measure it. It goes with this genus. Ouranopithecus macedonensis is what we call it when we say it to other people in rooms with chalkboards. Maiden I tried to say it and got lost around the N and the S. From Macedonia, she smiled. Because of where we found it? Our place. It's named for us. That's something. I liked that. Something of ours was so old that it made everything else look like a baby. I wondered if the ancient ones would have eaten cowlery if they had known what it was, and then I pictured a Miocene ape chewing a sesame bread ring and laughed so hard I choked on my own spit and had to pretend I was coughing because of dust. At home, when I told Papo about it, he leaned back in his chair and made a contented noise. An ape of the sky, he said. You see? Even the apes here are proud. Did it walk like me? I asked, and he shook his head. We don't know, he said. But we know that you walk like you do and that you should keep doing it. Head up. Not too fast. Not too slow. In July the world got stranger. The air felt like it had teeth. Men talked faster. My father didn't sleep and then he slept too hard. People met in doorways and stood too close. They put their heads together. In the evenings, in the city, people gathered under balconies and at corners. The radio said a name and then another name. You could feel the ground shifting under us, but not like a mosquito bite or a loose stone in your sandal. This was something that lived in the chest. My mother and aunt stood with other women on the main street of our village one afternoon. They had their aprons on still. They had put their dishcloths over their shoulders. They talked about the news and then they stopped talking and just stood, all in a row, as if they were waiting for a parade that had begun without them. Somebody started a small chant, a little one, not really a chant at all, more like when you sing with your breath, and the sound went up. I stood with them, my arms a line across my chest, my feet on the ground like nails. They didn't move. They were standing. Standing felt like something, like a proclamation. The men came out with their cigarettes and their hands in their pockets and they didn't say anything. They watched. It was the kind of thing that you do with a small smile that you cannot tell anyone about later because it was too simple to explain. On a hot evening, the city became a river of people. My father closed the shop early. He took me. My mother did not come because someone had to be sensible, and that is her job. We went in by the road, the bus too full, and the air smelled like sweat and perfume and oranges from a cart. We stood in Aristoteles Square. My father held me on his shoulders. I felt tall as the White Tower. People spoke the names of men as if those names were all one name. I recognized some. I guessed the rest. The city breathed in and out as one thing. There were no tanks, not that night. Only people. On the ride home my father did not talk. I rocked on my feet in the bus, my hands on the hot bar, my eyes itching. Bipedalism is a good word, I whispered, because when I didn't know what to say I liked to say a new word and feel it bounce around my head. What? My father asked. Nothing, I said. Later, news came that in another place, far away, someone had found bones of a small young woman who had walked upright long before any of our grandfathers were thought of. Ethiopia. It was on the radio and my science teacher said it at school, face flushed like he had seen God. They said her skeleton was very complete. They said she had a pelvis like a bowl you could drink from. I pictured her walking through scrub the way my mother walked through the market, with purpose. I listened to the newsman try to say the name of the place, and I tried to picture it on a map that I had only seen with small pictures of boats. They said a name for her, a simple name like a girl in a song, and I wondered what her real name had been, and if it had had taste of dust in it. Dr. Eleni talked about it too, her face lit up as if someone had put a small lamp in her chest. Do you see, she said, spreading her hands over the hill as if linking one miracle to another. It is all a part. This here, this beautiful jaw that tells us about its life and food and place, and then there the way of walking. Not here. Not now. But somewhere. And you with your good questions. You see it better than some of us. You tie the threads. I didn't tie anything, I said, but my ears got hot. She smiled and mussed my hair with her knuckles and left a thin white smear, like chalk. That autumn I started sneaking to the hill between school and chores. My father's eyes were knives, they knew what I was doing. He did not forbid it. He did not say it was okay. This is how in our family we know what is permitted, it becomes a silence we walk through. They let me carry a notebook. My handwriting was good enough that sometimes they told me to write down a measurement. The numbers mattered. Where a thing was, how deep, how far from the stake with C4 written on it. It felt like I was doing something serious, like a real person in a book. I wrote slow so my numbers would look like someone's who knew what they were doing. Once, I smudged a 7 into a smudge and started to cry because it felt like I had knocked a hole in the day, but the Frenchman put his hand on my shoulder and said something in French that sounded like a slice of cheese, and then in Greek, we all smudge. We all fix. He showed me how to draw a little arrow and write the true number and then a letter beside it. The world can be corrected, he showed me, in pencil. Winter came and the hill went cold and hard. The paleontologists went away to their universities, their fluorescent rooms, their microscopes. They took the plaster jackets and the bags of dirt and the little bones with them. They promised to write. They promised to come back, but until that moment I had not thought that there was a world in which they did not always sit on the ground with their elbows against their knees in our hill. The Land Rover left a cloud of dust that didn't know it was supposed to be sheeted in frost. I stood under the cold sun and felt a hole like the one you get in a tooth when you suck on too many olives. My mother put her hand on the back of my head and spoke to me in an old voice, the one she uses when she tells me that sometimes the thing you need is not here but somewhere else, and that isn't anybody's fault. At school, I wrote a composition about walking. The teacher had asked for an essay on something important, and the other kids were writing about bread or soccer or bravery. I wrote about a foot. I wrote about the heel and the tiny bones in the middle like a basket of prunes and the big toe that faced the others like a father. I wrote about balance, about how walking is the thing humans do that makes us a miracle and a problem. I wrote about my papa's walking stick. I wrote about the way you can watch a person come down a street and know all the things they're not telling you. I wrote about Ouranopithecus by name slowly, carefully, and I wrote that maybe it had looked across a dry forest that smelled like thyme and thought about nothing so grand as history and only about whether its baby would be safe if it moved from shade to shade. The teacher gave me a high mark and said it was creative. He also asked me to stop making jokes in the margins. He did not like my drawing of our headmaster standing like a chimp. In spring I built a path. The hill had chewed a lot of ankles the year before. I stole flat pieces of rock from all the places you could steal flat pieces of rock without getting scolded, from the side of the road and from the useless corner of fields, and I laid them up the path to where the dig had been. The ground accepted them like a kind old man receives a fish at his front door. The children from the village helped, because children will help if you give them a job that looks like work and feels like a game. We argued about which stones looked like the right stones. We named the stones. One was a turtle and one was a book and one was a Jesus, and we put him in the middle of the path for luck, but then we moved him because he tripped people. I felt proud in the useless way you feel proud before you know if something actually works. When the scientists came back, they would step on our path, and maybe they would think that the ground loved them back. When the Land Rover returned in May, I ran to it so hard that I skidded in the dust on my heels and my sandals made little bits of ground leap up like fish. I didn't care. I collided with the Frenchman's legs and he laughed and said, "Mon Dieu," and then "My God," as if it might translate better. He smelled like cigarettes and a new kind of distance, the kind that lives in a man who has slept in hotels for too long. They had brought me a present. It was a little magnifying lens that you hang on a string around your neck. It smelled like nothing. It was smooth. It made everything look like a secret being told. When I looked at a rock, it became a landscape. When I looked at the hairs on the back of my wrist, it was a forest of pale, ridiculous trees. When I looked at a grain of sand, it was bigger than my house. It felt like my own bone. I put it on and it warmed to my skin. "We brought paper too," said Madame Shoes, holding up a stack that had the smoothness of the inside of a seashell. "We brought plaster. We brought wishes. That we will find the rest of the jaw," said Dr. Eleni. "That we will find anything. That we